got something new for you on the YouTube channel this week. We're going to be starting a scrambler build. Nut and bolt, you're going to be here for the whole thing. So, as with all things, we start with the end goal in mind. This bike, when it's finished, has got to go off-road around Tasmania. We're going to be doing a lot of hard Ks, and one of the boys needs a scrambler that's up to the challenge. So, we got a Sol Invictus Nemesis 400 for the base bike. We're going to start tearing it down and building it back up to exactly how we need it. So, an important thing to remember if you're pulling down your bike for the first time and you need to know where everything's going to go is to mark your cables as you disconnect them. So, I'm not doing that here because the speedo's getting replaced and the electrics are going to be run with the Purpose Built Moto black box. So, pretty much the whole wiring loom is going to get replaced. Remember when I first had a Nemesis brought into the garage from a customer? I never really worked on one before, but he bought me in this thing to sort of build him a cafe racer out of his first bike. I'd heard about him, a lot of people, you know, like giving them shit because they're a new company or whatever, but that first test ride I was pretty pleasantly surprised. The motor's good, it's super fun around town, and then being a 400 single, it's got a nice note when you throw an exhaust on it. Head out into the mountains, it's just as good. Like, I was fucking stoked on this little bike. Once you pull a bit of weight off and open it up a touch, you have a lot of fun on this thing. The Nemesis 400s have an external oil tank that hides just above the swing arm there, so they don't hollow out quite as nice as some other bikes, but we're gonna have a bit of a play with that and see what we can do. I've got a Electron carburetor on the way, so we're going to replace the stock carb with a performance Electron carb. Electron carb, they developed them in the US to not use any jets, so you can change altitudes and that sort of thing without having to retune your carburetors. Once they're set, they're set. So I'm looking forward to throwing one of those on and seeing what sort of numbers we get out of this thing once we've modified it. To go with the Electron carburetor I was talking about, we're also going to fit that up with the DNA performance pod filter. Shitty thing about airboxes is they look horrible. The good thing is they stop your filter from getting wet or muddy. So because we're using a pod filter, we're going to have to figure out a way to protect that thing from getting mud or, you know, water, slicked up dirt from the back tire when we're on this off-road trip. So I'm not 100% sure exactly what we're going to do yet, but I've worked it out on the Sportster project that we're doing side by side. This one we're going to have to get a little bit creative and maybe make a nice looking airbox, or I don't know, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. But on a build like this, it's sort of important that you think about those sort of things now rather than going on your first off-road trip and hitting a creek or a puddle and your bike chokes out because the air filter's full of fucking water. So if you're pulling down old bikes, one of these suckers is worth its weight in gold. It's an impact driver. You can get them from near on any auto store. Good for knocking out old seized Phillips heads especially because they're always stripping out. Quick knock with a hammer and it sort of shocks it loose and it'll pretty much pull anything out. You just got to make sure you don't fucking strip it first. Before you kick off fabrication, make sure you drain your fuel tank. You don't want 10 litres of fuel next to a welding arm. Another quick one before fabrication starts is to plug up any holes open into your motor. It seems obvious, but I see it a lot and blokes don't do it. You don't want any grinder dust or anything else getting in there when you're working on this bike. So if the exhaust comes off, plug the exhaust ports. If the carb comes off, plug the intake. So when I'm stripping out the electrics on a bike, generally I get rid of the lighting circuit and rebuild that with the black box. So on these, I will keep the regulator rectifier, I keep the factory connections that come from the stator and the starter motor, I keep the starter coil, I keep the CDI and the coils on the bike. Sometimes it's easier to strip the cables out of the existing loom. If it's an older bike, generally I just keep the plugs and I grab a wiring diagram later to come back and then rewire it. It's just a matter of fitting some new plugs on. On this one though, I think we're probably just gonna strip the cabling that I need out of the old loom, get rid of the lighting circuits, and we'll build up the sort of ignition circuit. And then once we come to fit all the lights on, put the buttons on black box, we'll come back through and build the lighting circuit separately. I feel like it's worth learning what a lot of this stuff does. For me personally, when I started, it helped me to sort of, if you understand how it works, it's easier to understand how to either modify it or repair it. A basic understanding of how the electrics on your motorcycle work can go a long way when it comes to sorting out a problem, or just even knowing how the regulator rectifier works or how your blinkers flash. All that sort of information is super helpful. So a while ago I put it down in a blog on purposebuiltmoto.com. It's called Motorcycle Electrics 101. There's two of them. There's one of them on rewiring your bike, and then there's another one on just the ins and outs of how this stuff operates, what your regulator does, what your coil does, how it gets its signal, what's the CDI do, all that kind of elementary knowledge that can really help you when you're starting to build a bike. Alright, what we've got here is everything we've pulled off the bike on the electrical system that's going to go back in. We're simplifying everything quite a lot. So we've got the regulator rectifier that runs down to your alternator. You've got the starter relay that'll go back on to fire your starter motor, and the CDI. What we've left on the bike is the key ignition switch and the spark plug coil. So for those guys interested, these CDIs aren't all that complicated. They send a spark signal to your coil that fires your engine. So you've got a spark lead that goes to your coil, you've got an earth, you've got an active in, and you've got a kill switch ground. So the kill switch ground is hooked up to stuff like your key ignition or your stand, which means it'll kill the spark if your stand falls down or if you turn the key off. Everything else is pretty self-explanatory, so I cut that out of the loom and then we'll link it back up later once the bike's almost done. To give you a little bit of an idea on just how far we're going to be going with this build, these are the parts that we're keeping, and this is all the stuff that's not going to be used. So pretty much anything in this box is going to be custom built or replaced with an upgrade. Once the teardown's done, I'm going to push this thing outside, give it a bit of a degrease, hose it all down. I'm a little bit precious, I don't like getting my hands dirty, so before I start fabricating the bike, always get a wash down so I'm not working with my grease and all the other shit that comes up on a bike. Alright, so once the bike's cleaned down, I'm going to run through and detab the frame. So chopping off all the stuff that used to mount the airbox, the side covers, all that sort of stuff that we don't need anymore. But when I'm doing this, I always get too excited. So before I get sparks flying around and end up chopping the wrong fucking thing off, I go through and mark everything that I have to cut off, and anything without a yellow mark on it, I leave, because it always comes to the end of the job, specifically the brake switch. I'll have the frame powder coated and then realize that halfway through the build, I've cut the brake tab off and I don't have any provision for a rear brake switch. It's always a fucking pain in the ass. So to avoid that, I use a pencil. finished detabbing the frame, cutting off all the excess brackets and stuff that we don't need. As you can see, I'm dirty as anything, but happy as a pig in shit. This area of the build is always good because I can kind of sit back, have a bit of a look at the bare frame, throw the tank on and start to figure out what we want to do with this bike. I never really plan out these builds. I like to sort of let them develop organically. Of course, we have an end goal in mind, but the styling of it and how it's all going to go together and be fabricated is something I try to leave up to when I get the bike to this stage. So that's it for the episode. I'm going to sit down and have a beer and think about what's next.